This is Eddie Wilson welcoming you to Austin Roots, a podcast about how Austin, Texas became flavored the way it is.
And this is Dr. Jason Mellard, a cultural historian, doing my best to connect the old and the new in this city we call home.
Or the center of the musical universe.
Dave Moriaty's path weaves through many of the Austin stories of the 60s, 70s, and beyond. He first arrived on the scene from Port Arthur, the leading edge of an influential cohort from East Texas, many of whom later moved on to San Francisco. In California, Moriaty was a founder of the Underground Comix publisher Ripoff Press, and then on his return to Texas, a key figure in the paper The Austin Sun. Thanks for taking the time to visit with us today, Dave.
Lord Almighty. I've been trying, Dave, to remember when I first met you, and all of the memories keep driving me back into the goddamn warehouse over in San Francisco where Ripoff Press was.
I can't remember where I met you either.
It seems like we got out there needing to play, and Ripoff Press was maybe a possibility of a place they could rehearse or something like that. I remember seeing Perry Lorenz for the first time I saw him there because he looked like he was a goddamn eagle all spread out over that press with those long arms, and I thought, wow, what a strange character. And the next thing I know, he's building the tallest building in this side of the Mississippi in Austin. And it's just unbelievable up there.
We often ask people what brought them to Austin. And then I think everyone knows that there's a whole Lubbock Mafia that's involved in the Austin scene. But Port Arthur has few rivals in terms of being an influential but unexpected point of origin in the Texas counterculture. I think like in all the history books, everyone knows that Janis Joplin is from Port Arthur.
Russianburg.
Right. She's a piece of the puzzle. She's just a little part of a larger group that includes yourself and Jim Langdon and Terry Owens, and many more. So I wanted to ask you first about what coming up in Port Arthur was like and why you think it launched the career of this group of friends in this way.
It's very simple. Port Arthur was one of the few places you could get a job during the Depression. They were building the world's largest set of petrochemical plants at the time. They got their pick of engineers and chemists and chemical engineers and welders and pipe fitters and everyone from all over the country. My father graduated from MIT in 1930 and immediately got a job with the Bell Labs, which was like the leading electronic research group. And then in 1933, they furloughed them all. Bell Labs had never fired anyone, so they didn't know what to do except furlough them. And he hung around New York City until he ended up eating at the Salvation Army. And then he went back home to Winthrop, Massachusetts, and got put to work in his father's wood flooring business. So when his friend sent him a telegram and said, I've got you a job at Gulf Oil in Port Arthur, and there is a passage on a Gulf tanker that's right now anchored in Boston Harbor. He didn't hesitate a second, you can imagine. And all the people I knew in Port Arthur, their parents' stories were very similar. That's why they were all there. Now, to give you an example, we had a 2,000-seat municipal auditorium in the junior high school. It was as big as this one in Austin. They would fill it completely with the audience for classical music or ballet. And Port Arthur at the time had a population of 60,000. And that was the consequence of gathering all these people from all over the United States. It was a very cultured town, in spite of what it seemed, or what it seemed like it should have been, right? At that small a size.
Yeah, so a high education level sort of rubbing up against, I think its reputation is kind of like a blue collar city because of the people working a lot of the plants too, but it's those two things sort of juxtaposed with one another. And you're right, we don't often think about all this expertise and culture that was concentrated in those petrochemical plants.
Well, of course, at mid-century, all that vanished because they increasingly put the plants on automatic controls, and we had perfected the refinement of oil to the point where there really wasn't that much more progress. And so they didn't need all those kind of people. So my generation didn't stay in Port Arthur. We all escaped, because who would want to live with the swamp and the mosquitoes?
That might be the title of the East Texas story right there. Yeah, so tell us a little bit about how you came to know this network of people. Who were you close to, or who did you meet first?
Well, Langdon and I and Grant Lyons and Randy Tennant were all in a group of hood intellectuals in high school. This brash kid named Janis Joplin forced her way into our group. And of course, she was underage at the time, and we really didn't want an underage girl coming to the Louisiana bar scene. You could go to Louisiana and the drinking age was 18 over there, but they didn't check your ID. So everybody went to Louisiana to the bars to drink. And Janis liked to prove her worth to us by causing trouble. And so we escaped, some of us escaped a lot of bar fights that were caused by Janis Joplin.
It sounded like a pretty rowdy scene from what I've read about it, those Louisiana bars.
Yeah, it was a rowdy scene. And they were so far isolated from civilization that the night we saw a knifing, some Texans started yelling, "Where are the police? Where are the police?" They said, "Oh, they'll be here in about 30 minutes. They got to come up from Roe Bridge or someplace like that." I got to Austin in 1959.
Which is sort of early. Are you one of the first of that cohort? Because a lot of them made the move to Austin and then from Austin to California, some. But were you among the first you came for UT, right?
Yeah. My friend Lyons got a football scholarship to Tulane, and Jim Langdon went to Lamar College, which is in Beaumont. And so it was me and Cookie Crawford and Randy Tennant that ended up at UT in 1959. And Terry and Janis were younger, so they wouldn't show up at college until the next year. But Janis started out at Beaumont.
And what was UT like and Austin like in 1959? What were some of your impressions at that time?
Oh, it was wonderful. My nose bled for, I think, 3 months because it was so dry in Austin. Everybody talks about the humidity here, but compared to Port Arthur, it was nothing. And there were all these people who were weird, and there were huge numbers of parties. And I was so scared of staying here that I made the dean's list my first semester at aerospace engineering. And then I figured out that I didn't have to work that hard, so I kept pretty much a C average for the rest of my 6 years at UT. The big deal was the Ranger, which was at the time the top humor magazine. And if you volunteered to sell Rangers on the campus, which was not a hard job, you got to meet a bunch of girls that way, and they sold out every issue, then they would invite you to the Ranger party. And the Ranger party was financed by part of the sales, and what they used that financing for was to buy booze. So all us underage kids could go to the Ranger party and find our way home on all fours late that evening by just keeping the tower in sight and heading in that direction. And then when dawn came, we would know where we were.
Let's talk about Jim Langdon a little bit. Eddie hipped me to him a long while ago. You know, he's such an important figure in chronicling the Austin scene in the 60s on the ground. How did he get from Port Arthur to here? What was he like?
Well, he was in English and journalism with the rest of us in high school. And he was an expert trombone player. And that year, our band went to state. And I think we won state. And he went to Lamar, and he almost immediately got married. And of course, a kid came along, and he dropped out of school and started working in the only job he could find, which was Friendly Bob Adams for a loan company. Friendly Bob Adams had friendly attached to his name because he was definitely not going to be friendly trying to get loan shark loan. And he didn't do that for long. And at some point, and he was making part of his living going to Louisiana and playing trombone with the bands at the bars. That's where he met the people that became Cookie and the Cupcakes and a few other bands. Anyway, finally, he faked a resume and got a job on the Lafayette Advertiser that hired him as a journalist. And he did really well there in Lafayette. And then first he got a job on the Picayune in New Orleans. And later he got a job with the Austin American Statesman. And that's how he got to Austin. He was, as he called it, their booze columnist, because he went around and covered the clubs and the bar scene. And that's when he got Janis Joplin a couple of jobs.
Eddie, when did Jim Langdon come on your radar, and why do you think his stint at the Statesman was an important one?
Well, it wasn't until I had survived and lived through all of my experiences with that scene on the first person level. It wasn't until I started doing research that Langdon came up to me. I was interested at a pretty early point about, all the things that had come before I fell into it. And Langdon was always the first example of getting any kind of major voice in the media world working for you. Yeah, he was a hero. He was kind of like in the same category with Travis Rivers for me. Travis is up, but you had to be kind of salty to speak out. Back then, it was my role model for not caring if whatever I thought might lead to a fist fight. But by God, that's the way it was.
It seems that he might also have been the first one to put the phrase psychedelic rock in print in describing the elevators. One of the earliest uses in mass media came from Langdon. Another point of overlap you guys have, I wanted to talk some about the Threadgills scene and sort of the eccentrics and outcasts who were working on the Ranger and sort of this world of UT in the early 60s. Moriaty, do you have experiences at Threadgills, including with Janis?
Yeah, Janis talked me into moving into the ghetto when she was moving out because nobody that was left could pay the rent and they wanted to keep the apartment. And I didn't understand at the time that it was an open public scene. So people would barge in on you and wake you up at 2 a.m. and have a party. But I was living upstairs from Powell St. John, and I was living in the same apartment building. It wasn't what you would think of as an apartment. It was a military barracks for junior officers that had been moved in there after the war. So the apartments they had a living room and a dining room and a kitchen and a great big bedroom big enough for 2 double beds and a bathroom. And that all rented for $35 a month, which included electricity and water. And that's Powell St. John and the others that hung around there, including John Clay, were where I got all my information as to where the cool places were to go, because I was still in engineering. And engineering, you can't bullshit engineering problems like you can when you're in journalism. And so that's how I got into the Threadgills thing, is that they said there was this cool gasoline station bar and there were a bunch of rednecks, but the bartender liked college students and wasn't real crazy about checking IDs. I didn't care because I was 21 by then. The folksing groups were going to Threadgills and he could yodel like Jimmy Rogers. He had a whole collection of Jimmy Rogers records, and Janis was immediately attracted to that, and Powell St. John, and so we started going there. Later, the fraternity people discovered it, and the scene sort of changed. Clark Santos and Jack Jackson and I bought a sailboat out Lake Travis in late '63, and we started working on it. And Clark and I had motorcycles, so on our way back from working on the sailboat at night, we would stop at Threadgills because we knew it was always going to be a scene. And that's my main memory of Threadgills. But by that time, I'm pretty sure Janis had gone to the West Coast. I did see her there earlier when we first started going. But it was really amazing, and it was what everyone considered far out of town. Out of town then was anything north of 45th Street, pretty much.
Eddie reminded me that one of the pictures of Janis that hung in his Threadgills for many years was, her propped up against your car. She was wearing it might just be like a work shirt and jeans, but as a reminder that so much of that early 60s stuff has more in common with the Beatniks rather than what we would think later was hippie, right?
Yeah, we considered ourselves Beatniks. My aunt lived in Burbank, next door to Doris Day and across the lake from Bob Hope, and had lucked out in getting an Oscar for costume design, which caused her to quit Warner Brothers just as the market crashed when television started taking over the movies, and she ended up designing costumes for things like Las Vegas and Sonny and Cher. Anyway, I was out there in 1958. And we went to San Francisco as a side trip. And I was all into the Beatniks at that point, and actually got down on North Beach and saw some things and people that looked like they might be Beatniks. When we started Ripoff Press in 1959, and just 10 years later, some of the Beatniks came and printed with us. And I thought, what a bunch of has-beens. Because back then, 10 years seemed like a great gulf of time. And why would anybody who was ravingly famous in 1958 still be hanging around in 1969?
Yeah, the world of Lawrence Ferlinghetti in 1958-59 seems worlds apart from what was going on in 1969 and 1970.
We all aspired to be beatniks. And we used to lord it over those new transplants from suburbia and tell them that we were beatniks before we were hippies.
Your path and your biography diverges. Like in some sense, there is this cohort from Port Arthur who comes into kind of the folk beat scene in Austin. A lot of those people then go on into this Texas migration in San Francisco. But your story is a little different in that you serve in the military in the middle of all of that, right? Vietnam is getting intense, and then you.
What happened was I had a research job with communications research, and I was programming computer for them. I got my first computer to program in 1962 in engineering, back when they were full of vacuum tubes. And then I wrote a program on a giant machine, and anybody could do that. All you had to do is go down to the co-op and buy a Fortran manual, and they'd let you program the machine that covered the entire floor of the computational center, probably 10,000 square feet. And it was about as powerful as, I can't think of anything that is so weak anymore. I got disgusted with research and things in general. Back then, if you had a student deferment, it extended your draft liability to age 35. So we always joked that we were pursuing a government-approved activity for youth under 35. And there probably were more master's degrees and PhDs that came out of that draft program than anything since, because people just stayed in school. The other tactic was you changed majors all the time so you'd never graduate. I decided I would take a year of travel and study in Europe, and you could do that with the permission of your draft board. So I went to Europe. Me and Jack Jackson went to Europe. Jackson was exempt, so he didn't have to worry about anything. And we got some motorcycles and slept under bridges and got separated from each other in Barcelona. And I never saw him again until I got back to the United States. And I ended up in Germany and actually enrolled in the University of Munich, and then graduated magna cum laude, which was actually a dropout. So when I got back, they drafted me. And of course, military wisdom being what it was, they put me in the combat engineers because I had an engineering background. And we were getting into some trouble. And this was January of 1966. And they were shipping us all to Nam because Lyndon Johnson had just decided to increase the military in that 1 month by 50,000 people. So the Marine Corps doesn't normally draft, but it did at that point. And that saved my life, as it turned out, because I was one of 6 people of the 500 that were drafted that day that went into the Marine Corps. And I got trained in mine sweeping, and me and my class were going to be educated by the Darwinian principles and not anything we knew from minesweeping class. Anyway, I finally got lucky and sent back from Harm because one day they lined us all up and said, we need volunteers. And my father, who was a colonel who fought in New Guinea and other places, said, never volunteer for anything. They said, we need somebody that knows how to type. And I thought for a long minute and then held up my hand. I thought, this wasn't what the old man meant. He said, don't volunteer for anything. Next thing, they had shipped me out to Camp Lejeune and put me in charge of a company office. They didn't have enough first sergeants. There was no way. So they promoted me to Lance Corporal, which is an E3, and put me in charge of this office. So I got to answer the phone and say, Acting First Sergeant Lance Corporal Moriaty, and the guy on the other end of the line would say, ho, 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 Lance Corporal, you made my laugh for the day. Now give me your top, meaning the top sergeant. And I would say, sir, I am the top. There'd be a silence, and he'd say, oh my God, we've come to this. That saved my life because I managed to run that office for several months. Then they rewarded me by shipping me to Paris Island, which the Marine Corps considers a reward. I considered it terrible.
So how long were you in the Marines?
I was drafted, so I got out in January of 68, and I made sergeant in 18 months because they were so alarmingly shorthanded, and they couldn't stand having a Lance Corporal answer the phone.
Yeah, you have experience in the Marine Reserves, Eddie, right?
Yeah, I did the chicken shit thing. I got out in a 6-month boot camp of infantry training. Didn't figure out until later that the recruiters discovered from my question and answer session with them that I was the sole surviving son of a deceased veteran. So there's no way that I would have ever been drafted. And I was wanting to join to keep from being drafted. So they sent me back to my mother with 2 blank pages that needed her signature at the bottom of each one of them. I delivered those back to them, and they filled out the paperwork over that so that she had signed that it was okay for me to give away my birthright by just doing this document. That broke Mama's heart.
I was chicken. I tried to join the reserves, and I took the test and everything, and then I admitted on the test that I got migraine headaches. They said, you flunked. And I said, but I'm drafted. They said, take this. He said, the armed services are the same for everyone. You take this failed physical down to San Antonio, and in San Antonio, they looked at my failed physical, and they threw it in the shit can. And they said, you're going into the Marines. Next time you get a migraine headache, let us know. Well, the trouble with my migraines is they only occurred when something good happened. And there wasn't anything that good happened for the next 2 years till the day I got out.
And if 1959 to 1969 seems like a huge 10 years. 1966 to 1968, those are some really important 2 years in this larger cultural story. And like we've talked about, a lot of the people you knew in Texas had kind of moved on to California, and you're going to end up there yourself. So I wanted to ask how that came to be once you're out of the Marines.
Well, I was in a strange place because when you're in the service, you get fed and you get clothes and you don't have to worry about any of that. And I think that's why some people like it. And when I got out, all of a sudden, I didn't have food or lodging or any money for clothes. So I got worried about getting a job. And I came to Texas, and my research boss at the university had gotten a job at Tracor. And he said that they had an opening and they would hire me in August. But I turned that down because I couldn't wait until August. This was January. So Langdon at the time was working on the Beaumont Enterprise. And he said, I can get you a job with my journalism degree. And they started training me. Then I realized that I wasn't doing anything to stop the war. Everybody I knew that got out of the Marines was really anti-war by that time. And all my friends were out in San Francisco marching and raising hell and all that sort of stuff. So I quit. I was about to get married, but I didn't, and left for San Francisco. And I got to San Francisco, and unemployment is real good for veterans. But they immediately got me a job with Pillsbury and Martinoni, set of naval architects, and they put me to work writing corrections for maintenance manuals for intercontinental ballistic missiles. Over and over again, we had to insert clean all mating / connecting surfaces with trichloroethylene. Failure to do so may result in injury / death to personnel. So I got a little sign made to put on my desk that said death to personnel. It occurred to me at that point that this was not anti-war work.
I was going to say, if you're motivated to see what you can do to stop Vietnam, that doesn't seem like the job.
So since I had newspaper experience, I joined the San Francisco Express-Times, which was the underground paper of note. And they had gotten their money. Marvin Garson's ex-wife had written an off-Broadway play that got very popular called Macbeth, which was Macbeth, where Lyndon Johnson was Macbeth. The money from that, she kept sending to Marvin Garson to keep the paper running. And I said, what we need is a printing press, not really knowing what I was talking about. So anyway, about that time, the Family Dog collapsed, and it looked like the scene was coming apart. And that's when I talked Gilbert and Fred and Jack into buying a printing press.
And was the idea that you were going to work with the Family Dog in Avalon and do poster work?
Well, the Family Dog failed.
Right.
But Bob Simmons and Gary Scanlon resurrected it as Soundproof Productions. They'd ostensibly been shut down because of the noise.
These are all Texans you're talking about, right?
These are all Texans. We called ourselves the Texas Mafia, dozens of us, into everything. And it was funny because the San Francisco's people weren't doing that much. They were mainly bystanders. It was all the people from out of town, from New York, from Ann Arbor, all those places that were doing things. And
Kesey's from Oregon, right?
yeah. And we got our start because Jack Jackson had been the exchange editor. Jack Jackson was a accounting major from Texas A&I, and he had enrolled in the University of Texas to get his CPA and ended up taking art courses. One of the few salaried things on the Ranger was the exchange editor. And he took it seriously. He got the Ranger shipped to every major college town in the United States. And he got a list of bookstores in all those towns that would take the Ranger. He set up exchanges with all the college humor magazines in the United States. Now, mind you, during this time, we beat out the Harvard Lampoon for being the best humor magazine in the nation for 5 years. So when we got to San Francisco, he had this list. So the first thing he did with the press was we published a catalog and we sent them to every bookstore on his list nationwide. And that's how things got started.
That's smart. That's the kind of logistics that we want to know with this, right? I don't know that story is out there a whole lot. And then the other principles too. Fred Todd is someone whose story I don't know as well myself. Can you tell me a little bit about who he is and how he came into this?
Well, we knew Fred from Austin. And when I got to San Francisco, he was a programmer manager at Applied Data Incorporated. It was one of these startups that didn't make it, but they were making software to run your business with. The reason I got back into his acquaintance was he had rented a house in Noe Valley, and Terry Owens had discovered Fred and moved in on him. Now, what I've realized from that is when a married couple moves in on you, you no longer run your house. So Fred wanted another vote, and so they put me in I guess it was the laundry room. Fred wanted to print art prints. In his spare time, he was going to the San Francisco College of Art. He thought it would be nice to own a printing press so he could print his art prints. Our first job was to print the cover for Radical America on our printing press. Well, we didn't know anything about printing, and we certainly didn't know anything about color printing, and this was a duplicator press. Duplicator presses are not built to register accurately. And we got Mary's Opera House, a place up in the loft to put our printing presses. It was an old washroom, so we cordoned part of it off and turned it into a dark room because it had running water. The problem was it had the only running water on that floor of the building. So then we burned down Mary's Opera House. Fred found us a guillotine cutter that had a 37-inch blade and a big bar that you hauled down on, and it would cut a stack of paper that high. And Jack joined because he wanted to publish a comic book to make some money. Since the Family Dog was failing, Jack didn't have a job then. So he trimmed all his newly printed comic books and made a big mess. And Don Donahue, being a very proper San Franciscan did not want to take the Excelsior cuttings from the guillotine cutter and all the other books and put them in somebody else's dumpster. But there was a redevelopment house next door to us that the vandals had busted through the floor into the basement. So Donahue knew that that wouldn't bother anybody if he threw all that down in the basement, because they were going to demolish the house anyway. And some neighborhood kid came along with a Bic lighter and dropped it into that bunch of confetti, and it went up like a bomb, and then it caught our building on fire. That was the beginning of hard times.
Where did you relocate to?
Well, as it turned out, redevelopment had just taken over our building, unbeknownst to us. And the rules said that any tenants had to be relocated. So they relocated us to a place. Well, meanwhile, the Berkeley Barb had just, everybody working on the Berkeley Barb had gone on strike. We were recapitulating all the 30s labor problems, because we were radicals and believed in socialism, right? So he locked them all out. So they got a place under redevelopment and started the Berkeley Tribe over in San Francisco. And so redevelopment put us in the basement of that building. Unfortunately, the basement of that building had about an inch of water in it. And Don Donahue had hooked his press up with ordinary extension cords, and they were going spark zap because he was running a 1.5 horsepower motor on ordinary extension cords. And I took one look at that and said, we can't do this. But we got a word that the old family dog office still had power and heat down on Gulf Street. So we picked up all the parts of the press we'd salvaged from the fire, and we moved it in there. And it had air conditioning, and it had a rug. And it also had tons of unsold posters still in their 23 by 35 inch boxes. And I called up Chet Helms, and I said, Chet, you've got all these unsold posters in here. I said, what do you want to do with them? He said, oh, that's all over. He said, just let them go. Well, we filled Fred Todd's totally inadequate Ford Falcon station wagon down to the spring blocks with family dog posters and put them in a garage on the Mission Street that Fred was renting. And I salvaged a handful of those posters and some off the wall, and I still have them.
I'm glad to hear that. I was afraid you were going to completely break my heart there and tell me they were all gone.
Redevelopment soon discovered us. Printing away. We were printing Motor City, Crumb's first, and I was homeless. I had given up my apartment because I'd quit the day job, and the press, when we had it at the other place, was paying us $5 an hour, which was riches. And we had tons of work. And then all of a sudden we were burned out, and a bunch of comic books got burned up, and we owed money to the paper place. And so I just slept in the family dog office and printed all day and all night. And so I think redevelopment found us and said, you can't be here. And they found us a place on Golden Gate, which was an old storefront on the corner, right where the new freeway spit out. It was in the bottom of an old wooden hotel, which was also going to be demolished. And we stayed there for almost 2 years, but we painted a big sign on the place. And so everybody coming in, commuting on the freeway, saw our sign as they came off the freeway. We just had all sorts of luck. They kicked us out of that later on to demolish the hotel. And they gave us $5,000, which you can read $50,000 today, to move all our printing machinery. And Fred found a 10,000 square foot building that seemed like a miracle. It had its own railroad siding, and it had 2 giant truck loading docks, and we moved everything into there. That's where Eddie saw us. Before that happened, the landlord discovered us, and we found that we had subleased from a tenant who hadn't been paying his rent and had no right to sublease. And the landlord said, you've got 3 days to get out. And that would have ended us right there. And I went down to our paper supplier, Rube Rubino, at Precision Supply, and he dealt in paper that was salvaged. So we got things like real watercolor paper for 15 cents a pound. But anyway, we owed money to Rubino, and I said, Rube, we've been trying to catch up, but it looks like this is going to be the end. He said, well, who is that landlord? And I said, Mike Roth. Mike Roth, he says, Mike Roth, I'll tell you what, his name is Rothkowitz, and he's my cousin. And the next thing I know, there's 4 of them in Rubino's paper cutter room, and they're all shaped like potatoes, and they absolutely fill the room, and they're yelling at each other in Yiddish. Now, I'd had German in college, so I could gather a little bit of the drift of what was going on. Anyway, Rubino was saying that we were good guys, and he would co-sign a lease in blood. And that's how we ended up with this giant building at 17th and Missouri Street, where Eddie first saw us. We rented that for the next 10 years, never missed a payment.
And Eddie, what took you to Ripoff Press? How did you end up there?
I was led by a very short leash to that whole California scene by Shiva's headband. I was living the life of an innocent one moment, and the next minute I was trying to figure out how to manage Spencer Perkin, and there was no such application available. Going to San Francisco and seeing people that I knew from associated through Threadgills, of course, but back to the Ranger and those days was it was bliss, compared to anything that followed. But it led me to that damn old empty armory, and all of a sudden, I had huge space to put activity in every day. And
you visit San Francisco, and you feel it as bliss when you're there with Shiva's headband, seeing what people are accomplishing out there. It's kind of funny because we just heard this long story about all these the challenges of real estate and facilities and personnel that you're about to face once the Armadillo gets up and running too. It seems like a perpetual, this countercultural work is not easy. In addition to the cartoonists that we all associate with Ripoff Press, were there other kind of personalities from the period of the era that you got to work with through the press?
Well, frankly, the cartoons never made any money, in my opinion. Publish the cartoons was our job printing, and we became the default printer for the Revolution from the beginning. We printed family dog posters. We printed straight theater posters. I still have the stuff we did for La Raza when it first formed. I still have all the pamphlets that we did for the Berkeley Revolution, various types. And we also printed lots of pamphlets and books from people that were, frankly, either schizophrenic or bipolar. They were very amusing, even though somewhat confusing. We printed stuff for festivals and all sorts of things.
And what we're doing here is so important and great. I really like having Dave, you sort of pull back the curtain, and these are all details of the working of the Ripoff Press that I don't know. I mean, I think bits and pieces of it are documented here and there. There's been some writing on Jackson before, some writing on the Underground Press. But we see how challenging and hard and gritty this work was. And I also don't want us to lose sight of the fact that out of that came this great art, right? That you facilitated, these tremendous cultural advances and changes in the comic form.
It was anti-war propaganda, a lot of it. We were the new Mad magazine, basically. The other problem was, somebody once told me when I was in journalism school that the power of the press is for those who own one. And I took that to heart because there were the obscenity laws, and there were the drug laws, and there were a lot of printers that did not want to print underground publications because they were afraid of the obscenities law or the drug laws or whatever. So that was the other reason we got a press. Remember, Larry Flint was in jail, and Timothy Leary was in jail, and possibilities were very real.
Did you have, in your position, a lot of direct dealings with the artist? I mean, Gilbert's working alongside of you. Can you give us insight into, say, Robert Crumb a little bit? Is he someone that you would have spent time with?
Robert Crumb would come to the parties. We would throw a party every couple of months, and this mystified all the people that came up from L.A. because it had no purpose. People from LA think your party is for PR or for launching a product or introducing a new face or whatever. And they'd come to our parties and say, "Why are you having this party?" We would look at them and say, "In Texas, you just have a party. You don't do it for anything." And they wouldn't believe us. They would look around to try to find what secret thing we were pushing for the party.
Like continuing the Ranger tradition.
Yeah. Crumb would go to the parties, and he would curl up in a ball on the edge somewhere and not talk to anybody. And then some days or weeks later, you would see people and their personalities absolutely accurately portrayed and savaged in Crumb's cartoons. Gilbert, on the other hand, would come to a party and dominate the place, and you would never know if he was taking notice of anybody or anything else at the party. And they were just polar opposites. I mean, you would think that Crumb was not noticing anything, just being terribly shy and withdrawing, and yet he was studying everybody.
There's also some of the stories that come up when we've talked with other people about Ripoff Press. There's invariably one about somebody getting their hair stuck in the machinery.
Oh, that didn't happen, but it almost did.
That was Perry, I thought.
No, that was me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, my hair did get into the rollers, but I had my hand on the switch. It was always a problem. I'm amazed that nobody got killed or injured. That 36-inch press weighed 7 tons.
God.
And it was totally obsolete. It was built by the Electric Boat Company when they tried to diversify from submarines into printing presses at the end of World War II. And it was a copy of a 1930s vintage Harris. And it never worked real well. And that's why we owned it, is because we got it for $2,300 used.
And your description of that paper cutting blade, too, made me a little nervous.
Oh, yeah. Well, Gilbert almost lost his career. He had loosened the bolts on the blade, and the blade came in a wooden cradle. But just reflexively, he grabbed the blade and went to set it down very gently. That blade is razor sharp. It weighs about 30 pounds. He almost cut his fingers off on both hands.
Oh.
We're rank amateurs,
Well, it's a DIY culture all around. Now, did you see Janis again during that time?
I'd heard vague rumors about Janis, but I didn't know the real amazing truth of things. And so Elbert McGrew had taken Jackson's job as family dog, art director, and I'd known Elbert from Austin. And I said to Elbert, "Do you know where Janis is?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, she's out in Marin County." No, she's at Noe Valley. That's where it was. And I said, "Can you get me in with her?" And he said, "Sure, take you out there." So we're driving out there, and he looks at me and he said, "Are you sure you know Janis Joplin?" And that was my first hint that something was desperately wrong. So we went out to her house, and she wasn't there. And Linda Gravenitis answered the door and put me through the 3rd degree. And finally decided I was genuine and said, "Janis is down at the washateria." Well, I go to the washateria, and Janis is folding clothes in there in this great big raccoon coat. And she looked up and saw me and came running across the washateria and jumped on me. She'd never done that before. So this was some sort of demonstration of she actually knew me. I was always shy about inviting her to the parties, but I was afraid she was going to think that we were just inviting her to have a class act at the parties. I saw her once again in Marin County in the house she had over there. And I saw her once at a comic art show in Berkeley, where she was sitting on top of her Porsche and complaining loudly to me that being famous was for the rats, because the only people that you got to meet were assholes who were brave enough to come up to a famous person and want to see them, and they all wanted something, and you never could trust them, and they really didn't care about you. But just to be sure, she every now and then would let loose with a yodel, just to make sure that all the people that might come up would know she was there. And that's the last time I saw her.
Yeah, it's the double-edged sword of that fame, right? She obviously wanted it, but it was also, it's a burden.
Yeah.
In terms of years, what's the sort of run with your time with Ripoff Press? So it starts in 1969?
Yeah, in January of 1969. Fred got us, not incorporated, but got us a business license.
And then you're coming back to Texas around 1973 or so?
1974. So I was there from 1968 until May of 1974, I believe. And I came back because the war was ending, and I didn't see any reason. When you lose your mainspring of social outrage, then things like Underground Comix turn into pornography. And I was, even though everybody from LA thought we were pornographers because they never could get any other message from the product, there were plenty of people that understood the product was a type of social criticism, but it was changing. And I wanted a real job. I wanted to get some money, right? I think my best year at Ripoff Press, I made $2,300. Now, that would be like $23,000 a day. First thing I remember I would come back to Austin to have a little vacation or to do some business, and I would always bring back a truckload or a station wagon load of comic books to give to Willie's. That was our main central distributor for Texas. And one night, I got in really late, and I normally stayed at my sister's apartment, but it was too goddamn late, and I was out of my head because I had driven without stopping 23 hours from San Francisco. And I went to Armadillo, and Eddie found me and directed me to the basement of the armory. Underneath the floor, there was a sub-basement, and there was a giant waterbed in there, and that's where I spent the night. Thank you, Eddie.
So with the O'Willies connection, were you going back and forth some during those years, late 60s, early 70s, Austin and San Francisco?
Put it quite frankly, the dope was coming in through Austin and being shipped to San Francisco. One of the few ways I made money was I was approached by Texans who will not be named, and they had a Chevy El Camino with a big V8 and two JBL Voice of the Theater speakers in the back. And they were going to give me $50, read 500 in today's money, to drive those speakers back to Austin. And they said, you're deadheading speakers that came out full of marijuana. So I made them open up those speakers and show me there was not a hint of marijuana in any of them. And drove that load back, deadhead, back into Austin to be filled up again and sent back out, probably with somebody that looked like a preacher or something, very straight, you know.
Oh yeah.
I think you scratch a lot of the early history of these music venues and businesses, and it doesn't take too long to figure out that smuggling helped bankroll a lot of it.
Yeah, there were people looking for money launderies here and there.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they generally didn't look in my direction. But
well, nobody knew what they were doing. They would think that surely Armadillo would be a place to watch some of it, but we couldn't even raise ourselves to this, to the lowest rung of the low bar.
In my opinion, marijuana destroyed the parties. At one point, the famous dope desert famine of San Francisco happened, and we don't know what broke the connections or what, but nobody had any boo anywhere. So we got several kegs of beer. It was in somebody's apartment. It was the best damn party.
Some folks have to just take charge, and some folks get to lay on the sofa. Behind your back, people call you Ramrod. You were always one of my first role models, when I walked into that, Ripoff Press, and here's a gun I'm building as big as the Armadillo, but full of all of this equipment and these people working to crank out a product, and all I got is a big old dumb empty barn of a noisy, echoing sort of, and no money to do anything with it.
You made a success, and
well, I mean, a success because the press reads good. That's all.
So, as someone who went back and forth between Austin and San Francisco a little during this period, how would you compare them, or how would you characterize how Austin changed since your earlier time there?
Everyone knew in order to get anywhere, you had to leave Austin. There were no jobs in Austin. There was the legislature, there was the university, there was the lobby, which were mostly lawyers and other hangers-on. But if you were going to stay in Austin, you had to adopt a vow of poverty. That's why Gilbert ended up on the West Coast. If he hadn't done that, he would have had a local comic strip in the Daily Texan and maybe some underground stuff at O'Willies. But everything that went into the Daily Texan was censored, so you couldn't do a lot of the things. And just about everybody had to leave Austin in order to do something and get recognized. Now, of course, it's just the opposite. Everybody comes to Austin in order to do something and get recognized.
And what was the opportunity that brought you back to Austin in 74?
Well, it was that there was no money in publishing. There never has been, and there never will be. I got a book about Mad Magazine in the early days. I always imagined them in a Manhattan Tower somewhere, right? They were basically in a garage apartment, scraping together the rent every month. Here they're running a huge national magazine that's famous, and they're living like we did at Ripoff Press. And so anyway, when the war started ending, there was no need for propaganda anymore, and I wanted some money. So I came back to Austin thinking maybe I'd get a job on a newspaper or research. As usual, there weren't any jobs. Some guy, the son of a man who ran modern methods when Xerox machines were rare enough, so you went to a store to get copy. And he had a bunch of Xerox stores, and his son had taken printing class at ACC and talked him into getting a little multi-lith duplicator press. And his son-in-law was unemployed, and this was embarrassing to Mr. Modern Methods because he was a friend of Darrell Royals and all that. So he decided he would invent a job for the son-in-law. Then he put him in charge of the press, and they started doing quick printing. And when I got into town, somebody let them know that I knew how to run printing presses, so they, in lack of another job, they hired me to run the press. So the son-in-law would come in about once a month and lord it over us and pretend to be the manager. And me and John Harms ran the shop. And that's how I printed all the armadillo posters. The son-in-law got back into school, so he didn't need a job anymore. So they shut down the printing press. So I was out of a job again. Jeff Nightbird and Michael Aiken came to see me where I was living on Travis Heights. They came to me because they thought I was rich. They thought I had all sorts of money from Ripoff Press. They didn't know I had come back into town with a Gulf credit card and $15 in my pocket, and that was the sum of my assets.
They thought about you the way that you thought about Mad Magazine, right?
Yeah, and the last thing I wanted to do was to get associated with another goddamn underground place where we would all starve to death happily, right? So I told him no. And then I got bored, so I went over there and volunteered. Since I was on unemployment, I could volunteer without pay. And they were about to go out of business. They'd had $26,000 they'd gotten out of the Guilty Liberals and said that they were going to do a new, more popular Texas Observer. And the checkbook was full of empty check stubs where people had torn out checks but not written anything. And there were no records. But the $26,000 were gone to the point where the December issue was going to be the last one. And they'd only just started that September. So that would have been like blowing $260,000 in today's money and having nothing but bankruptcy to show for it. Well, I said, how do you know who's paid for all these ads? They were all ads in all the issues. Nobody kept any records. And I said, how do we know who's paid and who hadn't? And then I got a bright idea. We'll bill them all. The ones who have paid will squawk. Maybe some of the ones that hadn't paid will pony up. So we billed them all, and they paid up. And we had enough money to keep the paper running. So that's how I got made managing editor, because the paper had a board, and the board of directors was not happy with Nightbird and Aiken at that point because they'd spent all their money. So they really liked what I had done with collecting the money. But, that was just another underground thing where we all starved to death.
Well, that's a really good detail. It mirrors what Jackson did with Ripoff Press of having the mindset of, having this address book and being able to send out to people. The Sun could have had a much shorter shelf life than it did if you hadn't had that idea, right? Had some smarts about.
And we put it on a bookkeeping basis. And the other thing I did was shut things down in January because we'd get no ad revenue in January and start again in February when they were starting their spring ads. And that would give us a chance to make some money. And the way to make money was to drive some of Doug Breeding's decrepit trucks down to Chetumal in Mexico and sell them in the free zone 2,500 miles from Austin, and then take the plane from Merida back to Houston. And you could do that, and it would give you an adventure and living expenses for that 1 month when the paper wasn't running. And Big Boy Medlin went on that cruise, and a whole bunch of other people.
Yeah, the Sun, it's interesting to say that it's, I've always thought of it as the next evolution of the rag, but you're right, seeing it as kind of an alternative pitch to the Observer makes it make sense. Even if it has this really short run there too, like there wouldn't be an Austin Chronicle without the Sun.
They copied us shamelessly.
Yeah, and then of course, like no South by Southwest without the Chronicle. So it's a piece in this chain that's hugely important.
The reason the Sun died was they couldn't control the expenses because the people at the top weren't interested in making money. And Nightbird talked Jay Stokes, who was the son of the contractor that built Memorial Stadium, into buying the Sun. What Jay Stokes didn't understand was Nightbird was not authorized to sell the Sun because he didn't own it. Jay Stokes, unlike Nightbird, was not judgment proof. So he ended up paying off the employee backlog, and he bought the Sun, and we had kept the Sun going for about 10 grand in loans from 74 till 77 when I quit in disgust. So I'd had enough. And then Stokes took it over and put everybody on what he considered reasonable salaries. And in 6 months, he lost $60,000. So he sold it to Bob Barton, who was a liberal. And Bob Barton, in the next 6 months, lost $50,000.
Yeah.
But Jay Stokes transferred all our stock and everything that we still had and did it all legal and straight. And at the end, our liberal friend tried to turn it into a suburban weekly. There was no market out in the suburbs. And he wrote us a letter and said that all your stock is worthless. We're shutting it down.
Yeah, so is that 77, 78?
I think that was, maybe it went through 79.
Right.
That was the end. And then the people that started the Chronicle got together with me and Sarah Clark and wanted us to work for the Chronicle. But my God, we had an infant daughter and we needed to make some money. And we'd already done that. But the Chronicle showed that it was possible to start and maintain an alternate weekly newspaper in Austin, Texas, and actually make money. So the Sun wasn't that bad an idea after all.
In your time as managing editor, do you have a favorite piece or a favorite writer? In terms of the content, were there things that you were proud of or excited to introduce into the world there?
I wrote a couple of things I thought were fairly good, but Michael Ventura and Big Boy Medlin were the popular people on the Sun. We had a lot of good writing, political writing. We got a lot of writing deadline day in a box that was not organized or anything. One time the cover story came in that way, and we would have to rewrite it. But that's where daily newspaper training comes in, because with a daily paper, you're producing a full 600-page novel equivalent every day and making no mistakes and no misspellings. You think of a daily newspaper.
It is. And even they're kind of losing their edge now, because I think a lot of that, professional sense and the profitability of it. But it really is quite an accomplishment. It's quite a feat.
Well, we had people with master's degrees in English that were editing the thing. We had people that were as good proofreaders as anybody I've ever known on any national newspaper. We had a lot of good people working there, and it was all because you could live for almost nothing in Austin, and we were having fun, more or less. And there were no real jobs to be had. The best job that anybody had was proofreading for the Texas legislature, and that was a lot of the loser jobs. The absolute bottom was working in Doug Breeding's junkyard. Next to the bottom was working at Oat Willie's, all right?
But, you get compensated in fun a little bit, like you were saying with the Sun, right? Like those seem like good people to be around, both at the junkyard and at Oat Willie's.
Yeah, well, a lot of people that worked on the Sun went into impressive careers. My late wife, Sarah Clark, became the head of archives at the Center for American History, for instance.
One of my favorite spots in town.
Yeah.
When we talk about Ripoff Press, or we talk about the Armadillo World headquarters and the music scene, all of those leave like records and an imprint behind that new generations find them. But I want to make sure that future generations know the role of institutions like Red River Motors, giving jobs to people, being a node of the scene that didn't leave, records or newspapers or comic books or any of that behind.
Well, even if you just sit with a stack of the comic books and look through them, you realize, hey, there's a whole lot of talent, that must have been living around here somewhere to have put all this weird shit together.
Well, and Red River Motors, for instance, was where Billy Lee Bramer died.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I don't know where exactly.
Well, he was in that house that's next door to Artie's house. They had those two houses there. My 1870-something map has Red River Motors, all the houses and all the sheds on it. So that was frozen in time for decades, probably over a century.
Wow. Thank you so much for taking the time, Dave. I've always known of your exploits, but we've never crossed paths, and I feel really lucky that this gave us the opportunity to do so. So thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, buddy. Austin Roots, executive produced by TSSI, produced by Renee O'Connor. Crybaby, courtesy of Jake Andrews Music. You need to get the memoir so you can get ready for the pop quiz. Go to threadgills.com and get Armadillo World Headquarters a memoir. Do it now. Do it right.